Patient Draws was apparently a former Russian sailor who somehow mysteriously ended up on our shores. No matter how many times he was asked, he refused to say how. One thing was certain. He was facing death, that is, until, in open court, he was allowed to speak in his own defense. Apparently, the judge was just too curious and had to know why Draws had done the horrendous things he had done. Apparently, he had killed a handful of small children. Rather brutally, he was in fact caught in the act, and his last victim did not survive. It took 6 very large, very muscular police officers to subdue him with numerous blows from their truncheons. Draws came into court in heavy shackles, with a broken nose and 2 swollen eyes, barely able to see out of them. It's very difficult for me to talk about this case. Draws is more like a hairy beast than a human being. Large, hairy, very muscular. When he was allowed to speak, he ranted and raved that he had not killed any children at all, that he had killed monsters who simply looked like children. Horrible monsters who, according to Draws, were sent from the very depths of hell itself to corrupt humanity and to ultimately destroy the world with sin. Ironically, Draws insisted on making it very clear that he was a devout atheist, which seemed very odd. The judge let him speak for a very uncomfortable length of time, until finally he had no choice but to declare Draws insane. No matter how much outrage there was, it was blatantly clear that Draws believed what he was saying, and he acted upon that belief. The judge really had no choice. The police were never able to track down any of the parents of Draws's victims, which isn't surprising considering, with the exception of his last victim, they never did find the bodies, although Draws did openly confess to numerous child killings. When he arrived here, he was assigned to Dr. Gaines. Dr. Gaines is also a large, hairy, muscular man who speaks fluent Russian. Draws could speak a few words of English, which is odd because he seemed to speak perfect English when he was ranting and raving, but then claimed he knew only a few words of our language, and for the most part refused to speak anything once inside these walls except Russian. Well, Dr. Gaines is the only one on staff who speaks Russian. And so the murderous ex-sailor from Russia became a resident here. Dr. Gaines is a very private man. Very little is known about him. He is known for being extremely professional. I had been at the asylum for 2 years when the incident took place. In that brief span of time, I had noticed that whenever Angela would visit any of the wards, no violence broke out. And in the span of 2 years, there had been a few incidents of violence involving the patients. And it took me a while to notice this, but all of the incidents took place when Angela was not around. If a situation looked as though it might become violent and she was around, she would usually step forward several paces, and the closer she got to the patients who might erupt in violence, the calmer they became. I noticed this, and I began to ask my colleagues about it. But all of them claimed not to notice. However, Dr. Gaines did give me a sly smile, which lasted but a brief moment, and then he said he had to check on his patients and left rather abruptly. No one wanted to talk about what was happening. I decided to continue to observe Angela. My suspicions were proven right as more time went on. There was one huge exception, however: draws. Anytime Angela visited D ward, the other patients would become very calm. Draws, on the other hand, seemed to become angry, very, very angry. His cell was at the back of D ward, against the back wall, on the right side. Angela was careful to never go near his cell. However, one day, somehow, some way, while Angela was visiting D ward, Draws got out of his cell. He didn't attack her immediately. He simply smiled And according to the other patients who were later interviewed, Angela was clearly afraid of him. Thankfully, there are always 2 guards inside D ward near the door, and there's always 1 guard outside of the door. The 2 guards immediately attacked Draws. They knew his history. It was a brutal fight, very bloody, very gory. Curiously, hearing the commotion, the guard outside the door, the one who had the keys to all of the cells in D ward, opened the door, locked it behind him, and then, amazingly, did the unthinkable. He began unlocking the other cell doors. When he did, each prisoner would ignore him. Each prisoner refused to try to escape. Each prisoner would simply run down to the end of the hall, past Angela, where they would immediately begin beating Draws. It was the most incredible thing I had heard. I was not in D ward when this incident took place. The guard with the keys just kept going from cell to cell, unlocking them. And each time he did, each and every single patient would run down and begin beating on drawers. It was incredible. At one point, one of the female nurses, Bertha, somehow managed to get into the ward. Bertha is a very large woman, very muscular, with very manly physical features. She grabbed Angela and pulled her out, but surprisingly stopped short just outside of the main door. She put her weight against the door to keep it closed and told Angela to stay close. The other prisoners kept flooding down to the end of the hallway, throwing punches and kicks. One of the prisoners had somehow gotten one of his hands on Draws's throat and attempted to strangle him. But the man had a very thick and powerful neck. Still, it took a while. Eventually, one of the guards and a few of the prisoners flung Draws back into his cell and slammed the door shut, locking him inside. The man's beating was the most brutal one that had ever taken place at this miserable place. He was a bloody mess, a horrifying mass of flesh and broken bone. It was a miracle that he even survived. What was even stranger, though, is that once Draws was neutralized, the other prisoners immediately became calm again and simply walked to their cells, and the guard with the key, the only one on the inside who wasn't covered in bruises, the only man inside without any bruises, simply locked them back up as though nothing had happened, as though he had taken a group of dogs out for a walk on a sunny day and it was time to coax them back into their kennels, although he didn't need any coaxing. None of them did. It was a most shocking incident. When the board learned of the incident, they were not pleased. Dr. Davis had a great deal of explaining to do. However, when they found out which prisoner had been beaten nearly to death by a combination of guards and other prisoners, the board decided to look the other way. The entire incident was most shocking. Draws was sent to the infirmary, and he was strapped down. He was given some medical attention. His bones were set. He received some treatment. However, everyone expected him to expire, and I dare say that if he had expired, it would not have been a horrible loss. Yes, I'm trying to think if what had happened a couple of days afterwards was real or a fevered dream of mine. But it was real. Angela went back to D Ward while Draws was still in the infirmary. She thanked everyone for saving her life. And according to the new guards who were on duty, everyone smiled and praised her for being such a good girl, such a kind-hearted angel. Ironically, Draws lived. And 3 years later, yes, there was another incident.